Welcome to The Change Physician, episode 142. Welcome back to The Change Physician. I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my awesome co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And we wanted to discuss a topic that, just in passing, I thought would be a great conversational piece regarding whether you're maybe someone who wants to see a physician or you want to be a better physician. And well, really, the question is what makes a great physician? And there are so many articles and really some, what was it, the 1940s, or when was that, Kevin, that one of those?
Yeah, it was like 1946. There was a German article on, because, they'll republish them sometimes, these historical documents on the question of what makes a good physician. So this is obviously not something that is new. And
Right.
Probably all the way back till, the times of Galen. People were like, what makes a good physician?
Right.
So
yeah,
apropos to this conversation for sure.
definitely. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so, we were digging around and there's a lot of articles on what makes this, what makes a good doctor, et cetera. The one I particularly like was actually a study, and that comes back to, this is obvious. What it firmly defines anything about good or bad kind of is in many ways an opinion. And when it comes to a physician, there's an opinion aspect to it. But I do like studies, like rather just having our opinion kind of spouted off, because that's so easy to do.
Right.
Is actually, let's see what the overall consensus has been. And so I really kind of enjoyed this one, which was what is a good doctor? This is from 2002. No, I'm sorry. No, that's the wrong one. What is a good doctor? And this is from 2018. And they did a systemized review, and this was global too. So this was not specific to the United States.
Right.
And
it was in German originally, right?
It was in German originally, and then they kind of brought it down into 6 different categories. And I think it'd be kind of fun to at least go through those categories. Because that question becomes really important, because if you ask some sort of who's publishing the information, then you're going to get skewed results based on what it is. If you are a survey company, say like, oh, I don't know, something that rhymes with Hess and Famey, you're going to want to put something that what makes a good doctor is if you have really good patient scores, which is we should probably do that episode on that. Actually, the opposite is true. The people who have the highest patient satisfaction actually tend to have the worst outcomes in medicine, and those hospitals that have the highest patient scores, if I'm remembering correctly, also have the worst outcomes. Why might that be? So, and anyway, this is if we're going to something that's semi-neutral, which is not necessarily something that has an affiliate link or is selling a service, I like these categories because it's at least seems somewhat neutral.
Yeah. Well, since you brought up that particular article, I would say from their categories, I was going to start with probably the highest score would be general interpersonal qualities. And the second would be communication and patient involvement. Number 3 would be medical competence, skills and whatnot. 4th would be ethics. And 5th would be just general medical management. And the last would be teaching, research, continuous education. And I would I'd have to dig deeper, but I'd almost say that last one might be kind of like where they went to school and like all these fancy titles and things that maybe not as important as how you interact with the patient.
And see, I read that completely different, because I look
you?
at the teaching, research and continuous education, and I always default to, well, what's the definition of doctor?
To teach.
Right? And then I'm like, well, this is the last category that they're because this was a survey where they were actually figuring out what categories physicians in general through across the globe were sort of defining what makes a good physician. And teaching came in, was the last. I mean, I'm sure it's one of the categories, but it was the last one, the least frequent category that was being researched was actually on teaching, research, and continuous education.
Well, let me take that back. So they clarify about this is basically a commitment to a lifelong learning process. And of course, teaching younger colleagues and feeling like younger colleagues feel comfortable coming to them. So, scratch that last comment I made. I think there's there's no doubt. And in fact, it's very disturbing to meet physicians that are never willing to like reassess their practice and, associated with increased knowledge and understanding of things, aka some of the our previous colleagues that are still doing things that are not in alignment with modern pain science. But anyway, as far as those are, there are a lot of other articles that kind of have a, like when they talk about humanity, it probably aligns with ethics. So I think the categories cover a lot of the other different words they use for, important qualities of a physician. Did you want to tackle each one separately and dive into a little deeper?
Yeah, let's go from the top down and talk what they're saying, and then kind of add our take onto it as well, because I think there's a lot of good takeaways here.
Sure. Well, is the general interpersonal qualities, friendly is kind of nice. You don't want to be a total jerk. Making patients feel at ease and, showing empathy, maybe remaining calm. And, I think there's how you make, there's that quote I mentioned, I really want to mention it because I think it's just a great reminder. But Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. And there's a certain element of interpersonal communication that if you're being a jerk and you're arrogant, or you're trying to just sound smart and you're not really engaging with the patient where they're at and making them feel horrible about themselves, that's what they're going to probably remember, other than the thing they're coming to see you for that maybe is really giving them a problem. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at, and this came up over and over and over again, and just to sort of read what the study came away with, is the category of general interpersonal qualities contains personal attributes and behavior which are not connected to medicine directly. But the fact that it was studied so much kind of just demonstrates to me is that when we are involved in medicine, the whole, you're caring for others, so this interpersonal connection is really, really important. And certainly they mentioned, if you're a patient, how you connect is extraordinarily important. But and then you got to look at your colleagues, how you interact with your colleagues is also important. I would say from if you had to do a hierarchy thing here, I think for patients, it's probably more important. It's not quite as much as important, I think, for interpersonal skills. I'm going from experience there, because I got in a discussion the other day about like incompetent people that are well liked versus competent people that may not be as well liked. Who would you actually rather work with? And I was like, I would rather work with somebody who is competent and not necessarily well liked, as compared to the incompetent person who is well liked. So there's a limit on the interpersonal skills. But I would also say, though, from a patient perspective, when you can't judge that, and I'm not trying to insult anybody here, but it's like, if you don't know anything about cars like me and you go into a mechanic, that asymmetry of knowledge, it's very easy for me then to default to, oh, this is a friendly mechanic. Oh, he's such a nice mechanic, or she's such a nice mechanic. Oh, I keep bringing my car back every week or every month, but they're such a nice mechanic. That there's probably something more important would be their mechanical skills. So
I agree. Friends and family, they always make comments about how awesome or nice and he's the best surgeon. I mean, like, everyone says that. Like, who's telling you that anyway? But yeah, like, they like the way they make them feel, so they like to be around them.
So from a competent physician standpoint, like, if you're a competent physician, you're proud of what you do, and we've talked about this multiple times, this means that to really develop that strength of interpersonal communication. So we did the last episode or 2 episodes ago, or whatever. Sales and marketing is all about interpersonal communication. So you cannot sit back and say this isn't important. Really, how you deal with others and being able to communicate effectively is absolutely crucial, and even more crucial if you're competent.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I think that segues into this whole communication and patient involvement as the other category, because they kind of blend in a way. I don't know how you can really kind of separate them out, but the way they define that particular section is the ability to listen well, and then to also clear and understandable explaining, and just in general trying to give the right information to help patients make decisions, but to be kind of like co you know, developers of a plan, you know, based on obviously your medical expertise and what you believe is best for the patient. Obviously the patient has the ultimate say, but if it's a very paternalistic kind of approach, you might not be listening and actually either misdiagnose something, you know, read the situation wrong, make assumptions, or have a bias based on whatever you're seeing versus actually what you're hearing. And so I think that's very relevant, that you need to shut up and listen sometimes. Of course, if it's in an emergency situation, it's a little different, but you know, long-term chronic illness things, there's many times things behind, you know, the story behind what's going on that you may have no idea about unless you give some open-ended questions or give them a chance to speak their concerns and make them feel comfortable enough to share those things with you.
Yeah, and because of that overlap, it's going to be really specific here. The general interpersonal qualities, which was ranked so highly, or at least that people seem so important, was they were specific about the attributes and behavior. So it's sort of like how you act. Are you smiling? Are you friendly? Are you nice,
Likability.
polite? Likability. And then the communication and patient involvement is really specific about listening and more of the communication aspect. So that that people feel heard when you're talking to them. And then the second pack is that they understand what you say when you're giving them information. And yeah, I mean, so you can see that they're not exactly the same thing, because there's people who are really good listeners that may come off. I think about the gregarious, friendly, affable people, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're their best listeners. So there are kind of distinct qualities about that. I guess if you would choose to hang out with somebody, you know, they're the people that you would choose to hang out with just because, you know, have a beer or whatever somewhere. That's like, I think, is the general and personal qualities. But if you're having a bad day and you need someone to listen to you, then that would probably be more of that listening and or in that communication and patient involvement category.
Yeah. And as we're going through this, it's very clear that there's an importance to personal development as a physician. Like this is there's really kind of a huge, I don't want to say expectation, but there's definitely there's a lot that's expected of you, and to do some things well, depending on what you're doing, requires us to kind of hone in on some of the things that maybe we're not as trained in or skilled in, or just a general weakness of our own. But you know, some things are easier than others. This leads into like the third one is their medical competence, which that's where we spend most of our time. That we hope we have acquired over the years of medical school, residency, fellowship, internships, and et cetera. But we know that things are evolving in medicine, so keeping up with that is not always easy. Emergency situations can lead to maybe some, you know, tragic decisions that don't end well. I mean, there's a lot of stress involved there too, but hopefully with the experience that you are less likely and much better at dealing with the situations. But what they describe in the medical competence area was more about just like you know, being able to be a good diagnostician and finding a suitable therapy, finding a way to not just get, you know, zeroed in on this one thing you do, but looking at from a holistic view, like these are all the options, presenting it in an informed way, having that knowledge base and that understanding to be able to deliver on that in the other categories. So medical competence, skills, depending on what you're doing, require different things. Any thoughts, Kevin?
Yeah, if you're looking at the cognitive-based set of specialties like the internist versus the procedural-based specialties, so like your surgeon, you kind of look at those prototypical kind of divisions there. And you have to be competent in both. And do you make good decisions? And I think it's easy to gloss over this because people think, oh, medically competent, and we're thinking simply manual skill sets. Then it becomes really important for the surgeons to get the practice, to actually have the experience so they actually can do the operation safely and effectively. But I would say on the cognitive side, it doesn't get as much attention because this is not just depth of knowledge necessarily. It's also, is your thinking. Like good thinkers and internists in my mind, or any of those cognitive based specialties, should be honing their thinking, looking for bias, making for good decision making, looking for outside influences, of which many different types, understanding how your brain works when you're making a decision. I do think that that kind of competence, that medical competence, should be honed as much as if a surgeon's practicing tying a knot, you know?
Yeah. Slow and fast. What is it again?
Thinking
Think,
fast and slow, you know, that
thinking
should be
fast.
like a core requirement. I think all physicians should read that book anyway, but if
Yeah.
you're in a cognitive specialty where your primary intervention is good thinking skills, then it makes sense to hone your thinking skills. Those are, you practice those.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think in general, well, that goes on a whole other topic of like the devaluation of cognitive specialties versus a procedural based by, because procedural, I'm not to piss anybody off here, but the monkey work, you know, that's something that can be trained and practiced and but it's the thinking work that is usually less valued, but in my book is probably more important in a lot of ways, because it's so much more difficult to develop.
Sure. And, I think about one of the surgeons I work with has his mentor told him to read that book.
Oh,
And he encouraged everyone in the operating room to read the book, which I've read some of it, and it is kind of heavy, but it's definitely worth a read. I just keep spreading out my other things to read all at the same time, but it does
it's a heavy book. I mean, it took me 7+ months to read that thing.
Yeah.
Because I could only read little pieces and then stop.
Yeah.
And process it, right? Because that's the hard thing. You go out and you're training a physical skill, tennis, suturing, cutting, or grafts, whatever, right? There's a systemized process that's step by step by step, the sequential thing that you do. And you can practice those, and you can practice the specific movements that are associated with it. And it's pretty easy to divine, kind of what the pathway to expertise would be. What are the skills that you need to do to break down in order to do this procedural thing? Thinking is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I'm not really aware of any strong training programs that actually teach you. I'm sure they're out there, but they actually teach you how to think effectively, right? How do you actually break down? Part of this, the scientific method, obviously, but anyway, it's tricky. It's hard.
Yeah, and I think for this particular surgeon, using it in his personal life or professional life is helpful. And even though he does a lot of the surgical skill aspect, there's a lot of creative side to plastic surgery, but patient selection. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of psychology and a lot of assessing why he's thinking what he's thinking, and if he's, you're judging situations and if they're the right match for that particular procedure. So there's definitely a lot that I think he utilizes it for in all areas of his life. But unless you have something else to say about that, I was going to hit the fourth topic.
It's a big one.
It's huge. Ethics. So trusting a physician that should be honest. I would say most of us in this career, I haven't looked at a study to say, how can you prove that? That most people are trying to be forthcoming and honest. And unfortunately, there are the crazy Dr. Death kind of situations that are very rare. You know about that one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Out of Dallas. So being humble, honest, have integrity, maintain confidentiality, not violating HIPAA laws, which if you don't know what that is, look it up, HIPPA. I said trustworthiness. And I think these are things that they even mention respect for other ethnicities and people of different religious, even if you don't believe in the same thing. There's just this spans so many subcategories that we probably could do an entire topic or have someone on as a guest regarding this. But it's a sacred relationship. I think that people sometimes get desensitized that are not self-managing themselves, and you're gonna get in trouble eventually if you're not, watching out. I would say most people are going to try to do the right thing, but sometimes I don't think there are a few people out there that are maybe not as attuned to those concerns of maintaining an ethical practice. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's easy to pick out the outliers for who are unethical, right?
Mhm.
Like the doctor death and
Those are obvious ones.
well, but here's where that ethics comes in for the rest of us,
Mhm.
is when they're practicing like that,
Mhm.
why did it take so long for people to call it out? And that's the question about it, really ethics there. When you see wrong,
Mhm.
do you address it? Right. And from a physician standpoint, trying to be a better person, trying to be a better doctor by incorporating ethical treatment standards. This means, like, I think it's another one. People hear the word ethics. Oh, well, I don't, I'm not a bad guy and I don't operate on everybody. I'm not Dr. Death. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're thinking ethically.
Mhm.
And it's just like any of these things, is taking the moment to, well, am I a good doctor? And why am I a good doctor? What decisions do I make? And so I see this very tightly kind of wound up with the thinking that I was talking about before, is what are you doing to actively engage and analyze and do the self-reflection to support your belief that you are an ethical physician? Because I think in many ways that's the bigger problem that we have with medicine in general, is not the outliers. We think about them as being the ones that, oh, they've ruined it. It's the fact that the majority of us don't take time to actually reflect and think on, am I making the right decision? Did that pharmaceutical pen actually influence my mind? Oh, that couldn't have influenced me. Well, actually, that's what the data
It's just
says.
a pen.
And that I get so angry at this, because people, when it comes to ethics in medicine, so many people say, well, they just assume I'm an ethical person. There's no way that influences me. Well, if it doesn't influence you, they wouldn't do it. And if it didn't influence you, not every single study that talks about reciprocity wouldn't support that finding. So don't tell me that you're an ethical doctor and then you ignore these ethical guidelines or say that they don't apply to you. Take a moment to reflect on this stuff. If, rather than rushing into your confirmation bias and say, well, I'm an honest doctor. Are you? Do some active research to make sure, and then support that fact, I get on it because I think I get so angry about this stuff because I see it in myself. I did that.
Mhm.
I'm a good person. Well, why were you a good person, Kevin? I don't know. And then you start finding little things. Well, maybe I wasn't good. And you have to do that reflection on it. And then you have to say, well, how could I be better? And I do think as a profession, we need to do better. And that comes down to that ethical standard, and recognizing that just because we're doctors doesn't mean like we're the greatest thing in the world. And just because you think you're a good person doesn't actually mean that you're a good person. And just because you think you're doing the right procedure on the right person all the time and you're such a good doc doesn't make you actually a good person until you've actually analyzed that and looked at some objective indicators to say yes or no, that's actually true.
Well, it makes you think of one of the last things I was thinking is that subtle kind of like where physicians can rationalize procedures
Mm-hmm.
For the sake of deep down it's subconscious need for income, desire for more revenue, or literally cognitive. Like you're thinking I need to do more procedures and you find a reason to do it versus not really the patient needs it. And that's incredibly disturbing too, and trying to be honest with ourselves as part of that ethical journey as a physician. Like if you care about patients and you're honest with yourself, and like Kevin always says, be aware of why you're doing what you're doing, the general awareness, those if you can keep those things in line, the medical system would do better. Problem is that's not what's happening across the board.
Yeah, and again, comes this global kind of and it's human, right? Humans, and it becomes easy to do the default thinking. Whatever the fast thinking is actually the default of what you're likely to do, right?
Right.
If the decision comes easily, if the supporting evidence comes really fast and easy to your brain, you're more likely to default to it. But we've picked on procedures a lot, but this ethics includes other things. Like if you're seeing documentation about gender wage discrepancies, your immediate gut action shouldn't be, that can't be true, right? Oh, it's because they take more time off or they have kids or do this. Those are supportive arguments, but the fact of the matter is, go to the research and actually challenge those beliefs that you have. If you think that there's no racial inequity in modern healthcare, you're like, well, those studies are all 150 of them are false. Well, if you're going to put that supposition, or if your behavior is going to reflect that, then ethically, then it is your job to start documenting and start analyzing your practice habits to either confirm or deny that bias takes place. It just gets so upsetting with this stuff, is that the easiest thing to do is to say, that's not me. And when it comes to a lot of these really challenging things, not just in medicine, but really in our society as a whole, when we're just not willing to even think, well, what if that is me? What if I actually have a racial bias? Well, because all the evidence shows that if you have any sort of colored of skin, you have racial biases, right? There's tests about this stuff. And to pretend that you don't, to pretend that there isn't these inequities in our system, the fact that women physicians are treated different than men physicians, or male physicians. I just think that there's an arrogance. Somehow we went through medical school and something, just because we got the degree or we finished the residency, then somehow we can turn our brains off and just like, well, I know, obviously whatever my opinion is the right thing. And because I say I'm a good doctor and there's obviously no inequity in the world, then all these inequities that everybody else is documenting simply don't exist. That's not an ethical brain. But.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And it's not, just because you may know more than the average citizen of the United States that doesn't have medical training doesn't mean you just stop learning.
Yeah.
You got to keep progressing forward. All right. So that was the fourth of 6. And the fifth one is about medical management. There's just a lot of parts to being a physician. It's not just interacting with the patient, but your due diligence on keeping up with literature from time to time, and what's the common practice and what's acceptable practice, but also just putting in orders, following through, charting, some relative like organizational skills. I mean, you've got to have some kind of level of organization and vigilance for details. There can be a huge ethical breach, or I should say a HIPAA violation if you are lackadaisical with some stuff and share the wrong information with the wrong patient. So there's a lot of, like I said, there's a high bar for being a physician. If you want to be a great physician, you have to kind of deal with all of these areas and try to, we're all human, we're not robots, but we need to remember that there are definitely some things that some of us might need to work a little bit more on than others. But any thoughts on organizational skills and medical management?
Yeah, I think the key word with this is management, because I'm thinking, well, medical management is not necessarily the same as medical competence. Competence is sort of the personal attributes that you have, but medical management is thinking as a manager, right? I would use this in sort of a military hierarchy is the difference between an officer and say an enlisted person. Both are vitally important, but when you're a commissioned officer, your thinking and your behavior changes because now you're in this role of leadership. So you have more of a responsibility. You have to make sure that your team is on board. And then there's also a way that you have to present yourself in such a way that when you are giving, in a military situation, what are orders, that people will take your order seriously. And I think in the physician, this medical management comes back to is being able to see patterns and seeing the whole picture of the organization, and then being able to present yourself in such a way that when you are doing orders, that people take your orders seriously, because they respect you, and again, maintaining that. And this is not, trying to be elite or trying to be, I guess elite is the biggest one. There's this move in medicine to make everybody equal. Not everybody's equal. The decision makings change. And at some point on certain levels, if you are the one who is ultimately responsible, then you need to be making those decisions, which means your behavior and how you interact has to be different, as well as everybody else who's listening to you. Those defined roles there. I think in modern medicine, this idea that we're all equal is detrimental because of that. Because then if everybody's equal, who's taking responsibility?
Right.
Instead of doing this.
Yeah.
And we see so much of this in so many different ways. So
you got all wide receivers and no quarterback.
Yeah.
How's that going to work?
And then who do you want quarterbacking, right? Do you want quarterback,
Right.
someone who's got the depth of knowledge, the breadth and experience to be the quarterback? Or do you want the person who, they recruited from the bar, like that movie? There was a movie where they got the quarterback from the bar because he used to play. I don't remember. Mark Wahlberg was in it. I can't remember. Something about the Eagles or something. It was solely based on a true story. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. We are all important as human beings. We are all equally important as human beings, but we have a different level of risk within the medical profession. So like you said, you have to maintain some hierarchy there. In general, we're taking the highest level of risk with patients. And so it falls on our shoulders, even though everyone else is part of the team. The problem is that even if someone in your team messes up, you're still having to take responsibility. You're kind of the coach of the team. You can say that, show the quarterback, whatever you want to say. So yeah, I've really had a hard time with this whole provider this, provider that, and stripping titles. Like, that's just absolutely absurd. I'm not saying I'm better than you. I'm saying I was willing to do the training, the education to take on the risk that's involved with the job of people that need care. But anyway, we can go off on another episode on that. If you don't have anything to say on that one, I was going to go to the final one that we touched on already. Teaching, research, and continuous education. And as we discussed, like a lifelong learning process. But I was thinking about how, doctore, that you mentioned before in other episodes about the meaning of doctor to teach. It's interesting because you think of it not just teaching patients, not just teaching the next generation, but also teaching the world and changing the landscape of how medicine is practiced in the future via research. So I think that also ties into self-reflection on our own biases as physicians. We're trying to create more data and information to kind of take some of our own personal biases out and maybe just have a better reflection of what's really going on and its impact or outcomes for patients. So those are my thoughts. This is it's incredibly important for the future, not just the current state, but the future of medicine.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Completely agree. If you're going to call yourself a doctor, then you better know something about teaching.
And there should be some value. I mean, I don't know. I guess my bias is I enjoy teaching if I know something, or I think I know something.
Well, that's how you figure out if you know something, right? Is you teach it.
Yeah.
And it was the old medical thing where we say see one, do one, teach one, right? That teach is actually really, really important. And you start discovering what you know and you don't know when you teach it. Because if you're a good teacher, you should be able to understand it and be able to communicate that understanding in such a way that somebody learns from you. And it's not easy. I mean, that's a whole, teaching is hard work. For a good teacher, it's very, very hard. It's
like being a translator, because the medical field and knowledge or terminology is a different language. And so for the typical person, if you're talking 6th grade to 8th grade education levels, you've got to kind of, you're not dumbing it down, you're just simplifying the context or the words used, or using comparisons to something they understand in their own life to help them, understand the situation or make changes in their life or whatnot. So yeah, I think there's an art to that, and refining those skills. It requires you, I think, to have a little bit of a passion for it. I think the more you enjoy doing it, the more you'll try to be a better communicator. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, well, it's like anything, right? If you enjoy it, or and you feel in it, and you feel, the more competent you feel, the more likely you are to do it.
Right.
And so the problem is with any initiation of something is we tend to feel not competent
Yeah.
or incompetent, and so we're less likely to try and
Or stumble.
or to stumble, and
hate it.
that's a discussion about our fear of failure culture in the United States and how that influences what we do. But it's getting through that what do they call it? There's unconscious incompetence, where you don't know anything, and you don't know anything. You just kind of stumble around. Then there's conscious incompetence, which is where you know something that you don't know, but now you're trying to stumble through it. That's super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's like the first phase of like real learning. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's probably a good thing. It means you're learning something new.
Right. Right. And we're all about change, the change position. So
That's right.
And today we just covered all 6 of the general categories of what a good doctor is. And I hope that you found a little insight in maybe one of those topics. Kevin, you want to take us out with maybe a final?
Sure. I would say the last thing that's kind of changed, we typically will see things in this like a sequential cause and effect, and we want to rank this and say, okay, well, number 1 is general interpersonal qualities. Well, that was the number 1 that came up over and over again when they were during the survey.
Mm-hmm.
But rather than to think that this is you start here and you do the next one, I kind of look at this as a Venn diagram. All of these are important skills to develop as a physician.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're trying to do is make that equal portion where all of those overlap and come together as one, whereas you is how you practice. That's really the key, is to see all of these as important, rather as this is this and this, and that cause and effect sort of fashion, but important. And hopefully you guys have competent doctors if you're a non-physician, and if you're a physician, hopefully you're growing, and you're growing as a human. Super, super key. And as always, if you want to grow with us, you can join us at thechangephysician.com. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.